My name is Jacob Ronald Heinske, Jake to my friends, and I am a former private first class in the United States Army. I joined the Army because I had made a couple of mistakes and I was looking for a fresh start in life, something with a little bit of adventure and excitement, which I definitely found. I spent 12 months in Afghanistan in Regional Command East, up in the mountains in Logar Province at a forward operating base called Fob Shank. While I was in Afghanistan, an average day would start at about 0600. We'd get up, get dressed, go down the road to the dining hall, eat breakfast, and then across the street to the motor pool. Since I was a mechanic, we spent most of the day either doing preventative maintenance on the vehicles or identifying problems, replacing parts as they came in. A normal duty day would end between 1730 and 1800. Unless there was a mission upcoming and there were mission essential vehicles that needed to be fixed, at which point we would work until all of the work was done, because that's just what needed to happen. Other days I would pull a guard duty rotation. Those days would start at about 04. We'd report to the company headquarters, get driven down to a different DFAC, or dining facility, to get chow, rendezvous with the chief of the guard, and get driven out to our towers. We sat in a guard tower from 06 until 1400. My tower specifically was on the southeastern corner of the base, looking out over an old wadi, a dried up riverbed area. It was about a kilometer and a half to the nearest building, let alone town. It was a very quiet corner of base, but we did always have to be on lookout because it was not impossible that someone could sneak up through the wadi or drive up along one of the roads, so we did have to be aware to make sure that no one was getting onto the base. After the tower duty, we would go back to the main part of base, get dinner chow, maybe a nap, and then report back to Company HQ at about 2000 to collect night vision goggles, heavy machine gun, and an armored vehicle, and we would sit in the truck from 2100 until 09 the next day, guarding one of the south entry points, making sure that no one came onto the fob without authorization. All told, it was about a 30-hour day, which could get pretty rough. Preparation for our deployment to Afghanistan really started about a year before we left. It was actually at the battalion's formal ball, and yes, I do mean formal ball dress uniforms and pretty gowns. It was announced that our unit had come up on orders and we were officially headed over. At that point, we began mission-specific training, learning how to maintain the vehicles that we would be using downrange, learning about the area, the history, the culture, the 17 species of snakes that would kill us, the camel spiders, and everything else that was going to be new to us when we got there. The most intense part of the training was the month that we spent at the National Training Center in Southern California, before we left. It was the most realistic simulation that we had been to. It was a month of the most realistic training that we could get on American soil. In addition, we also went through weapons qualifications and were issued all of our new gear. We actually wore a different uniform in Afghanistan than we did at home, so we had to get a duplicate of everything we already had in the new camo pattern, which I found kind of amusing. One of my funniest memories from my time downrange was an incident where we were replacing all of the hydraulic lines on one of our recovery vehicles because my buddy and I had wrecked all of the hydraulic lines on the recovery vehicle the week before. And I got cut pretty bad on one of my fingers. So I went and got a bottle of clean water and a rag and a couple of Band-Aids, went out the back door, and I was washing the cut off to bandage it up so I could get back to work when my squad leader, my sergeant, came out the back door and looked at me and said, "Come on, we're going over to the medics. We're going to get you some stitches." I said, "Come on, Sarge, I don't want to get stitches. I'd rather just bandage it up and carry on." And he looks at me and he says, "I tracked you out here by your blood trail. You're getting stitches." So, needless to say, I went over to the medics, and when I walked in, one of the medics immediately took a look at my finger, said, "Come on back, we'll get you sewn up." And as I was walking into the exam room, the corporal said, "Oh, don't worry. This is her third time doing it. She's getting a lot better." Great, that sounds wonderful. She did a fantastic job. Week later, I go back to get the stitches taken out, and as soon as I walk in the door, I tell them what I'm there for. One of the other medics says, "Oh, I'll do it." Okay, sounds good. She seems enthusiastic. And then she says, "I've always wanted to try this." Coincidentally, she also did it perfectly, so at least that went well. One of the most difficult things about my job while I was in Afghanistan was how far away from home we were. We were pretty much on the opposite side of the globe from where we were accustomed to being, so supply lines were a lot longer. A lot of the parts that we needed for our vehicles were in Afghanistan or in staging areas in Kuwait and could be shipped out within a couple of weeks. But some of the rarer or larger and more complicated parts could be on back order for as much as 3 months before getting shipped over. So we had to shuffle a lot of vehicles in and out of our limited workspace to keep the flow moving, to fix things as we got the parts for them and move them on. One of the other major difficulties was actually the weather. A lot of people, or at least a lot of people that I've met, assume that everything that America has been involved in lately has been deep desert, a lot of heat, a lot of dry, and that was not the case where I was. Up in the mountains, we got snow in the winter. It got down to about -20 Fahrenheit. Don't know the Celsius, I'm sorry. And we had standing 2 feet of snow on the ground at any given time during the winter, so anything that involved getting underneath a vehicle as it was outside or having to work on anything that wasn't in the bay, everything was cold, and that was not pleasant And a lot of our work was outside just because we only had a very limited amount of bay space. And so simple fixes were done on the lot, on the fly. Another difficulty that we ran into was all of the equipment was old. Most of the vehicles that we were working on had been in country for anywhere between 5 and 8 years by the time that we were working on it. So even after being properly maintained and taken care of, after that long, any vehicle is going to start having problems, and vehicles that occasionally take fire are obviously going to have those difficulties magnified. And so the simple fact that we had gotten the vehicles when we got there rather than bringing them over with us was something that we had to deal with, something that we had to work with. One of the things that I really wanted to do while I was in Afghanistan was get to see some of the countryside and get to see as much as I could of the country and the way that people lived, which as a mechanic was not something that is necessarily that I'm necessarily going to be doing. But since we were supporting a distribution platoon, which ran parts and supplies from our base, which was a relatively self-sufficient, relatively large base, we had our own airfield and helicopter fleet. But our distro platoon ran supplies or parts and anything else out to smaller FOBs that didn't have those facilities of their own. And I actually got to go out on 2 missions during my deployment, one of which took me through Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, which was a very strange experience for me. It was completely unlike any city I had ever seen before, and at the same time, certain parts of it felt extremely familiar to me. One of the things that struck me most about Kabul was the extreme opulence and beauty of certain parts of the city contrasted with the drastic poverty in other portions of it. The zoo with the marble columns across the street from the market made of shipping containers struck me. Actually, one other funny story, if I may digress. While we were passing through Kabul, going through a market square, it was called up over the radio that one of the lead trucks had noticed that someone standing in the crowd was taking pictures of the convoy with their cell phone. And it was our policy that if we saw anyone doing that, we would stop and politely ask them to delete their photos. So we stopped and we're looking out over the crowd, and there are probably 10,000 people in sight. And we're calling over the radio, who was it? Can you describe them? How are we going to find this person, this one amongst thousands? And they call back over the radio, he's wearing a bunch of mirrors. We look out into the crowd, and sure enough, there's a man, I assume he was a mirror salesman, wearing mirrors on ropes, just strung all up and down his body. And so we sent out a dismount, and they went and talked to him and explained that he really needed to delete those photos, and so he did, and we carried on.